In early 1940, a close friend of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was dispatched to go and see the possibility of creating a concentration camp inside of Poland. This man, Rudolf Höss, would go on to become one of the most brutal war criminals of the Second World War, and he was a man who would have the blood of millions of people on his hands. Höss's report was favourable to the establishment of a concentration camp, and what emerged was Auschwitz, the deadliest site of the Second World War. It was within the barbed wire fences here that at least 1.1 million people were sent to their deaths and were killed, with many of them being slaughtered inside the death factory within minutes of their arrival at Auschwitz. It was notorious for its cruelty and sadistic guards, with women such as Irma Grazer and Johanna Bormann being known for carrying out murder with their own hands, and they were responsible for torture and overseeing the prisoner workforces with brutality. But established inside of the site in 1942 was specifically a women's camp, a place where many thousands of female prisoners were locked up inside of, and this part of Auschwitz was known for its horror, as many of the prisoners were subjected to terrible treatment. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the women's camp of Auschwitz, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Within the Third Reich's concentration camp system, many thousands of women were locked up and imprisoned inside various different camps. The largest all-female camp established was Ravensbrück, and this was found relatively close to Berlin, and the importance of this site was that many of the women who were imprisoned here were later sent on to Auschwitz to work. Ravensbrück was a site which was known for its terror, and many female guards of the concentration camps trained here. Women such as Irma Grazer were schooled in how to establish a reign of terror over other prisoners, and they became Aufseherinnen, or female overseers, who were told not to be afraid to use their whips, pistols and weapons to strike fear into the hearts of the inmates. With Rudolf Höss creating Auschwitz, along with the thousands of other prisoners that were being sent there, Auschwitz would expand to a huge extent over the years. Höss wanted to create the most efficient site of slaughter that he could, and he was the one himself who even trialled the use of gassing within the poorly ventilated basement chambers of Block 11 of Auschwitz. But throughout Auschwitz's time in operation, roughly 30% of the prisoners registered at the camp were women. Of course, there were many more prisoners who were not registered, as they were slaughtered as soon as they entered the site, and they were not recorded by the SS officials. There was a call for a women's camp to be established within Auschwitz, as the first female transport of prisoners arrived at Auschwitz on the 26th of March 1942. These first women prisoners were 999 non-Jewish German women sent from Ravensbrück, and they became the founder prisoner functionaries and the first inmates of the women's camp that would be built there by the male workers inside of the complex. To begin with, the women stayed in a separate part and section of Auschwitz I, the main administrative complex within the camp, but then in August 1942 they were transferred to the newly built women's camp that had been set up inside of Auschwitz II Birkenau, the extermination centre of the camp. The women's facility was then set up, or the Frauen Konzentrationslager, and these were 15 brick and 15 wooden barracks, but by October 1943 there were 32,000 women living in this camp. Some of these first women were given different roles inside of the women's camp, and some were given power to punish and wield rules over other prisoners who were sent there. Rudolf Höss wrote of these female capos that it was easy to predict that those beasts would mistreat the women over whom they exercised power. Spiritual suffering was completely alien to them. These women were given the prisoner numbers 1 to 999, and this was tattooed on them. Many of the prisoners who were sent to the camp were forced to have their heads shaved in the delousing at Auschwitz. When prisoners arrived at the camp, they were subjected to what was known as the selections. The prisoners disembarked from the trains that arrived on the railway yards, and they were selected to either be admitted into the camp or be sent to their deaths. Those who were believed to have been fit enough to work for some time were let inside of Auschwitz, but those who were not were sent straight to their deaths inside the gas chambers. Many of these victims were women and mothers who had their children with them in their arms still. They would not live hours past being sent and arriving at Auschwitz. Many of these women were driven into the chambers by ruthless female guards who were known to have patrolled the selection yards. The second mass transport of female prisoners, made up of just under 1,000 women, arrived from Slovakia on the same day that the first arrived, and this was the first registered transport sent to Auschwitz under the office of Adolf Eichmann, a notorious Nazi who would then, decades after the war, be finally executed for being responsible for the deaths of millions of people. A third transport of women arrived 2 days later, on the 28th of March 1942. This was roughly 800 Jewish women sent from Bratislava. There were also a large amount of women who were imprisoned inside of the gypsy camp in Auschwitz, and thousands more were held inside of Theresienstadt, which was not too far away. The conditions of the women's camp in Auschwitz were horrific. They were absolutely terrible. This was noted when a group of male prisoners in October 1942 entered the camp to create an infirmary and hospital structure there, but when they got there, they had to search for women who had not died, and there were corpses everywhere. One former prisoner of this specific site wrote of the conditions that there was one latrine for 30 to 32,000 women, and we were permitted to use it at only certain hours of the day. We stood in line to get into this tiny building, knee-deep in human excrement. As we all suffered from dysentery, we could barely wait until our turn came, and soiled our ragged clothes, which never came off our bodies, thus adding to the horror of our existence by the terrible smell that surrounded us like a cloud. The latrine consisted of a deep ditch with planks thrown across it at certain intervals. We squatted on those planks like birds perched on telegraph wire, so close together that we could not help soiling one another. The women were also forced to conduct very hard labour, and they worked on destroying buildings, carrying out construction tasks, building roads and other infrastructure, and much more. They worked in command units too, and these women worked inside of the hospitals, kitchens, and in other jobs. One of the most sought-after jobs given to the women was inside of an area of the camp known as Canada, and these women would sort through the property which was confiscated from prisoners upon their arrival. There was a huge amount of disease which spread around Auschwitz, as typhus caused chaos, and this led to a significant amount of death. Many of the women were also selected by the SS doctors to get involved in experiments, and some were forcibly sterilised, and they knew that if they did get summoned to Dr. Mengeler's medical block, then there was a good chance they would never make it out alive. Until the summer of 1943, pregnant women inside of Auschwitz were slaughtered, and they were later allowed to give birth, but their children were tragically killed. Many were subjected to forced abortions also. Overseeing these women were many different female guards, who were known for their evil and brutality. Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann were both known for their terrible treatment of the prisoners, and Bormann, for example, was known as a woman with the dog, and she encouraged her huge pet to savage and maul inmates. Marie Mandel was a senior overseer who succeeded Johanna Langerfeld as the Lagerführerin and practical female commandant of the women's camp of Auschwitz. Mandel had taught many other women to become guards at Ravensbrück, and she had a reputation for cruelty. At Auschwitz, she was seen regularly patrolling the selection yards, selecting those who were to go straight to their deaths, and she was accused at the end of the war and was executed for being complicit in the deaths of over at least 300,000 people. There were also male SS guards who oversaw female prisoners, as SS Obersturmführer Paul Müller and SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Hössler were drafted in to keep the women in a constant state of terror. There was a total of 131,000 female prisoners who were registered as inmates inside of Auschwitz. This included 82,000 Jewish prisoners, 31,000 Polish women, 11,000 Roma. The remaining inmates came from all over occupied Europe during the Second World War, but as mentioned, there were many, many more who were not listed on the camp's records, as they were murdered in the gas chambers as soon as they got there. At the end of the Second World War, many of the women were suffering from terrible diseases, and their treatments took a while for them to get better, and many died from the conditions they had been kept in. For many of the women, their experience in Auschwitz was said to have haunted them for the rest of their days. There were a number of women who at the end of the Second World War were executed for their crimes, as they were condemned for the slaughter and death that they caused in what became the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War. The suffering of many women inside of the camp was harrowing, and one report to the Commandant Rudolf Höss documented the terror of a group of prisoners that was all too familiar. This said, the transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we were unable to obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. There were thousands of female prisoners who died inside of Auschwitz concentration camp, and today many of their stories still remain untold. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.